Part 1. Toe Sticks for the Heart. Chapter 1. The Importance of Taking Time. The Importance of Silence. And so for me, being quiet and slow is being myself, and that is my gift. Fred Rogers during our first meeting. If you ever fall into quicksand, the most important thing to remember is this: take your time. Quicksand, unlike water, will not move out of the way to let you pass. Instead, it resists movement. Flailing about will only cause you to sink deeper, but slowly gets you safely to shore. It's no accident that each episode of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood opens with a shot of a traffic light flashing in yellow caution mode. That message is the essence of every episode. It's time to slow down. The daily ritual of replacing his dress shoes with sneakers, his suit jacket with a cardigan, has, as Life magazine observed, a way of lulling you. These days there are few proponents of slowing down, especially in television. Most children and adults are so accustomed to the fast pace and fast images that taking time seems like a waste of. The faster the better. Even science bears out our obsession. You can break a thing's resistance the faster you push it. But there are some things that resist hurriedness, like quicksand. Quicksand and other substances that react in the same way are called non-Newtonian because they behave differently than those substances Isaac Newton identified as having the properties of an ideal liquid. If you try to run your fingers quickly through a non-Newtonian fluid, the substance becomes hard, almost like a solid. But if you move your fingers slowly through it, the material yields effortlessly. Mr. Rogers knew that the same principle applies to a child's emotional development, to a child's soul. Hurriedness causes it to be hard and resistant, but taking time and going slow nurtures, or as he liked to say, nourishes. The adult soul needs this kind of nourishment as well. I'm sure he wouldn't mind my saying so, but Mr. Rogers was decidedly non-Newtonian in nature. His message was clear: slow down, take your time. I mean that when I want to do a thing, I like to take my time to do it right. He sang in his trademark song, "I Like to Take My Time." The gift of going slow. During my first visit to the neighborhood, Fred was taping a series of episodes on fast and slow. While trying to show an appreciation for both modes, the balance definitely tilted in favor of slow. When Mayor Maggie sang Peace and Quiet too quickly, it seemed out of sync, ruining the natural rhythm of the song. Picture Picture showed that some workers, like crane operators, have to go slow to do their jobs. When the trolley sped by at faster than usual speed, everyone in the neighborhood of make-believe was alarmed. And Daniel Striped Tiger felt inadequate because he couldn't say his ABCs faster. Mr. Rogers knew how hurried children are in all areas of their lives. School schedules may follow a fixed schedule, he once noted, but human development doesn't. The episode's themes were appropriate for my time there, since the first question I had already decided to ask him was why he so often emphasized slowing the pace and taking time to reflect. Why was that so important for his audience? He paused, of course, before answering. I think for me, I need to be myself. Another pause. And I've never been a kind of hyperactive, run-around kind of person. I think one of the greatest gifts that we can give anybody is the gift of one more honest adult in that person's life, whether the recipient be a child or an adult. And so for me, being quiet and slow is being myself, and that is my gift. Sometimes that gift is lost on others. Prolific sci-fi writer Peter David wrote about seeing Fred Rogers on Johnny Carson's The Tonight Show, observing that even though Fred exchanged his cardigan for a suit jacket, he was Mr. Rogers through and through. Johnny was so taken aback that Fred talked in the same slow, measured cadence that he used on his program that he could hardly hold back the laughter. "You want to laugh, don't you?" Fred asked Johnny. "It's okay." And Johnny did. It seems to me, though, Fred continued in response to my question, that our world needs more time to wonder and to reflect about what's inside. And if we take time, we can often go much deeper as far as our spiritual life is concerned than we can if there's constant distraction. and often television gives such constant distraction, noise, and fast-paced things, which doesn't allow us to take time to explore the deeper levels of who we are and who we can become. It turns out that Mr. Rogers' ideals are more than philosophical. His non-Newtonian bent can be quantified. Yale psychologists comparing Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood to Sesame Street, which I also watched daily during my children's preschool years, discovered that children were better able to follow the stories on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood than the faster-paced, hip and hip-hopping world of Sesame Street. Another study concluded that Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood led to an increase in tolerance of delay, meaning that children in the study who watched the program were more likely to be patient in waiting for materials or for an adult's attention. Sometimes slow is better in understanding and learning to be patient and going deeper spiritually. I asked Fred if anyone else on television shared this distinction with Mr. Rogers. "Amy, this may sound like a cop-out, but I watch so little television," he apologized and then added firmly, "and I don't mean to be elitist about that. There are members of my family who watch a lot of television and get a lot from it. But I would much rather read. In fact, Joanne has been on a concert tour this past week, and I haven't even stepped into the room where the television set is." Perhaps that was the essence of his success. He was a television icon who avoided the constant distraction of television. Instead, he opted to read. Struggling with the taking time toe stick. I've struggled with this toe stick of taking time more than any other that Fred passed along. He admitted that he wasn't a hyperactive, run-around kind of person, a term that more aptly describes, well, me. As a typical type A who would rather eat standing up and who prefers to have all her plates spinning at once, like the guy who performed on the old Ed Sullivan shows, I excuse my behavior by saying I have what management expert and author Tom Peters calls a bias toward action. Fred was also a perfectionist. Guests who appeared on the show were sometimes surprised to find that he wanted them to follow a script, not just ad lib. Children, he insisted, deserved something well-planned and well thought out. And he was enormously productive in his life, filming more than 900 episodes of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood and writing more than 200 songs. But he also fiercely guarded his time of quiet and reflection, as you'll see in the following chapter, and he always took his time. Now, for somebody who is naturally very effervescent, Fred added while still answering my first question, I would think that being quiet and slow wouldn't be a directive for that woman or man. That person would be best being herself or himself. Do you understand what I mean? And even though I did, I also realized that he had chosen the better way. But Fred was patient with me in the years that followed our first meeting. He taught me that taking one's time, especially in relationships, allows the other person to know that he or she is worth the time. A few years after this discussion, when I was in the midst of an exhausting move to a new community, he wrote to me in a letter, "Just as it takes a tree a long time to begin to grow again once it's transplanted, so you can give your healthy roots time to find the nourishment of your new soil and your new community." Wise advice indeed, because as a pastor's wife, used to moving, and usually up for the adventure, this proved to be the most difficult move yet. It was taking longer than I expected to settle in, to find friends. I was frustrated and lonely. Fred always sensed when something was wrong, and he always knew what to offer. Silence. Closely related to his encouragement to slow down and take one's time was Fred's emphasis on slowing down taken to its natural conclusion, an absence of all noise and distraction so that the only thing that remains is silence. "We will make the whole universe a noise in the end," says the elder demon Screwtape to his nephew Wormwood in C.S. Lewis's The Screwtape Letters. While extolling the virtues of noise in destroying a believer's reverence for the things of God, Uncle Screwtape also tells his demon-in-training nephew that sometimes quiet can be used as well, if it gives the person a sense of devotional mood while foregoing a real commitment to prayer. The reason this kind of quietness works, Screwtape explains, is because it bears a superficial resemblance to the prayer of silence as practiced by those who are very far advanced in the enemy's service. The enemy here is, of course, Christ himself, since the conversation is between demons. But C.S. Lewis's point is clear. Silence accomplishes more than noise, especially when it comes to prayer. Fred Rogers was one of those who was very far advanced in the Lord's service and who often employed the prayer of silence. It wasn't just the absence of noise he advocated, but silence that reflects on the goodness of God, the goodness of what and whom he made. Silence to think about those who have helped us. He knew that silence leads to reflection, that reflection leads to appreciation, and that appreciation looks about for someone to thank. I trust that they will thank God, for it is God who inspires and informs all that is nourishing and good, he once said. He used a noisy medium, television, to teach about silence. I was halfway to silence when I heard your voice, recited poet May Sarton on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, at Fred's request, since Halfway to Silence was his favorite poem of hers. Fred may have considered silence his most important legacy. When acclaimed musician Yo-Yo Ma visited the neighborhood and played Fred's composition, Tree, 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 on his cello, Fred took some time afterward to reflect. Let's take some quiet time to remember, he invited his television neighbor, to sit and think about what we've heard. And he did. It wasn't dead air to him. It was thanking the God who inspires and informs all that is nourishing and good. Another time on his program, he invited Sylvia Earle, noted marine biologist and explorer in residence at the National Geographic Society, to be a guest. The idea was to use an underwater microphone in an aquarium to demonstrate the noises that fish make as they're eating. The equipment was set up, the cameras began rolling, but the camera-shy fish refused to eat. "Come on," Sylvia coaxed, "chow time, dinner bell." The fish ignored her. Sylvia then told Fred that these particular fish are such noisy eaters that some people can hear them without a fish phone. Still, there was only silence. "Usually they have very good appetites," Sylvia said again, but the fish weren't listening. What a disaster, most crew members on the shoot thought. Surely Fred will retape the segment with a different aquarium and less media-shy fish. But Fred didn't. Waiting on the fish was a lesson in patience, and he was instilling an appreciation for their quietness as well as their noises. If we can learn to wait through the natural silences of life, he liked to say, we will be surprised by what awaits us on the other side. Fred always allowed time for silence. The older he got, the more he saw the need for it, he said. At the end of myriad commencement speeches he delivered, while accepting an Emmy for a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Academy of Television Arts and Sciences, in presentations at the White House, and even in Christmas cards. "May you be blessed with moments of silence and hope at Christmas and always," read his homemade Christmas card, with his own emphasis added. The thing Fred Rogers shouted the loudest was silence. Just be quiet and think. During our second interview, when we were talking about the mail he received from viewers, he said, "There are so many caring people in the world, so many caring mothers and fathers. We hear about the other kind, the ones who are always hurting people. But when we hear from people who will do whatever they can to give their children some nourishment, it warms your heart." And then he abruptly turned away from me and toward the camera. He had the fervor of an evangelist, seeing and seizing an opportunity to reach a lost soul on the other side of the camera. I wonder if you don't have somebody in your life that just the very thought of that person makes you feel better. He spoke passionately into the camera, to the person beyond the camera. It would be wonderful if you could take a minute, at least a minute every day, to think of such a person. Just think. Just be quiet and think, he said softly. It would make all the difference in the world. Then he turned back to me and said with quiet exasperation, "I just feel that there isn't enough silence, and I'm always asking people if they can just give some silence. And we're in a medium that allows so little of that. The last time I was at the White House, I said, would you please just have a half minute of silence to think about somebody who has helped you become who you are? And that whole fancy meeting, that whole fancy East Room of the White House, sitting silently, thinking about people who they might not have thought of for a long time that had made a big difference in their lives. When that meeting was over, one of the guards came up to me all in white and with the gold braids and everything. Fred motioned with his hand, touching his shoulders. And he said, "Mr. Rogers, do you know who I thought about during that half-minute that you gave us?" And I said, "No, who?" "I thought of my grandfather's brother." And I said, "How was he special to you?" "Just before he died, he took me to his basement and gave me his fishing rod. I hadn't thought of that for a long time." The White House guard went on to explain that he was very young at the time and that the bequeathal of the fishing rod before his great-uncle died had a profound effect upon him. In fact, he wondered if that was perhaps why he loved fishing so much and why he liked to teach the children in his neighborhood all about it. But it took those moments of silence requested by Fred in the fancy East Room of the White House to bring the legacy to mind. In fact, the guard had been just a year or so older than Fred was when Mama Bell taught him to make toast sticks just before her death. Looking back at that day in the White House, Fred saw the resurfacing of that memory for the guard as his main reason for going there. A great-uncle's fishing pole, a kindly neighbor's toast sticks, the gift of silence. Everyone leaves behind something. Passing on a gift. Sometimes what Fred passed on to me had been passed on to him by others. Just before my second visit to the neighborhood, Fred lost one of his dearest friends, and the world lost one of the foremost spiritual writers and thinkers of the 20th century, Henri Nouwen. I've often seen the awe that Fred inspired in people, but if anyone ever inspired that kind of awe in Fred Rogers, it had to be Henri Nouwen. Fred mentioned Henry to me often and was always encouraging me to read his work, a request I didn't honor until Fred passed away. When I visited the neighborhood right after Henry's death, Fred was taping a public service announcement in his WQED studio. I was on the other side of the studio trying to stay out of the way. "Do you ever read Henri Nouwen, Amy?" he shouted to me from across the studio. When I confessed I didn't, he said emphatically, "Oh, you would just love him." Fred wrote about his relationship with Henry in an essay for Christopher DeVink's Now and Then. In fact, it was Christopher who introduced them. While discussing the importance of silence, Fred wrote, "Even though most of the world knows Henry best by his words, I've come to recognize his deepest respect for the still, small voice among the quiet of eternity, and that's what continues to inspire me." And then at the end of the essay, he offered the reader silence to reflect on someone who has helped or encouraged them, perhaps a person who, like Henry and many of us, longs for deep friendships and reaches out to others in response to that longing, just as our God reached out through Jesus the Christ our Lord. And when Fred passed away, silence was offered at his memorial service for the very same reason. June 29th, 1997. Dear Amy, your beautiful note found me in Nantucket. Joanne and I have come for almost 2 weeks to get the Crooked House ready for the children and grandchildren. We've been blessed with the most beautiful days, clear skies, warm swimming water, and spectacular sunsets. In fact, the sun is making its way to the sea as I write to you. Wish you, Jeff, Jonathan, and Emily were right beside us this very instant. We'd probably all burst forth with the doxology, either that or simply stand in silent wonder. How good that you can show your children early in their lives the importance silence has for you. That will serve them all their days. May your heart and mind continue to be settled in God's tender care. Love to all the Hollingsworths. Fred. The importance silence has for me, I learned that from Fred.